Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. In continuum to our lecture regarding the environmental policies in India, we have taken note of the colonial policy and we have also taken note of the environmental policies in independent India. Now we are going to discuss that the policy relating to environment and sustainable development has now been categorized into the three categories. The first category happens to be the colonial policies, and the second policy happens to be the independent India policy, independent India's environment policy, and the third category is that we are going to have a contemporary perspective of India's policies. And this policy is important because as we have been in a position to having a deeper understanding of the colonial policies in relating to environment protection and independent and the post-independent India's environmental policy in relation to the forest, the wildlife, the water, the air, biodiversity, mines, minerals, fisheries, then we will be trying to have a very modern and contemporaneous perspective, or we can say that we are going to have the environment protection policies in a very contemporaneous sense, which is in practice in India. That means that what has been initiated after 2000 AD. And in this category of the environment protection policies in contemporary India, that remains the ambit and scope of the present lecture. And here we will be discussing that we had policies in relation to forest, we have policies relating to wildlife, we have policies relating to the policy statement on abatement of pollution, we have policy statement on environment and development, we have national conservation strategy, we have different sectoral policies in India, we have general policies, general environment policies, which we have captured under the National 5-Year Plan and the Niti Aayog's initiative about policy making in relation to India's environment. Then what we are going to do in this lecture is we are taking a scenario beyond these policy statement on environment and development, policy statement on abatement of pollution, and then national conservation strategy, which has been done in 1992. So in 2000, thereafter, how the India's environmental policy started radiating some basic shift and departure from the colonial policy, from the post-independent policy, and how it led to some degree of refinement in honing out the strategy for environment and sustainable development in after 2000 AD. In this context, it needs to be reiterated once again that all the 5 decades of India's effort to balance development, economic development, and ecological sustainability happens to be a kind of a pleasant exercise to understand that the country have engaged itself to the priorities, the parameters, and the basic precepts of the environment and development. Right from a Stockholm Declaration, the World Charter for Nature, National Global Conservation Strategy, the Rio Declaration, Johannesburg Summit in 2002. It determines the course and the national framework which try to integrate the global ideas like dematerializing growth, social metabolism, and degrowth influenced by the policy discourse. And these three aspects is very important, which have been reflected into independent India's policy, more so after the Johannesburg Summit on on sustainable development and the Delhi Summit on Sustainable Development, that how the Indian policy and law started gravitating around the sustainability ideals and how it tries to integrate economic, social, and ecological imperatives, and it tries to balance in such a way that it at least envisioned dematerializing the entire growth. It also tried to have a kind of a social metabolism. It also tried to see that the growth and degrowth influenced by the policy discourse requires a kind of a paradigmatic shift from the colonial policy to post-independent India's policy. Dear learner and viewer, this what has been opened as a synopsis of the present lecture. We will try to focus on the aspect of the National Environment Policy 2006, and that is the central piece of the evidence out of which we will see that how economic, social, and ecological concerns have been integrated in India's environmental policy. The second point we are going to make is the fact that so far we had policies on forest, we have policies on wildlife, we have policies on pollution, we have policies on environment and development in holistic perspective, we have policy on national conservation strategy, we have policies on water, we have policies, different kind of the policies. These policies are very specialized in character and try to give very careful attention to each and every segment of the environment. But the environment per se, we don't have a kind of an environmental policy so far in India. So for the first time, after a lot of judicial decision in relation to giving effect to human right to environment, it was considered that the Pilotara and the Catena of the laws which has been handed down by the Supreme Court and what has been the legally enunciated under the Constitution of India in the shape of Article 48A, Article 51AG, and a teleological interpretation of Article 20 of the Indian Constitution, taking right to environment and right as a human right and a basic right and a fundamental right, and giving effect to that right to ecological balance happens to be one of the sacrosanct fundamental right. It requires a kind of a subtle delineation by a umbrella, or what you can say, a very overarching policy which required, and then the environment per se, that we had an national environment policy in 2006, which is founded on these legal principles, which the Indian judiciary have very dramatically, silently, and meticulously, and gradually, and perpetually have inserted into the entire discourse of environmental jurisprudence and the onset of the human right to environment in India. Thus, what we see that the National Environment Policy is a very comprehensive document to be understood in the sense that it encompasses all sorts of the environmental problem, and the central attention and the focus of this national environmental policy is to see that how in India, that as we have two kinds of the problem. The first problem is that environmental pollution are being created in this country because of poverty, because of population, because of lopsided economic development, because of the low level of the growth, the low level of employment, low level of the purchasing power of the people, and then the environmental problem which are being attributed to the fact that most of the underdevelopment aspect of the Indian economy have created a lot of environmental crisis, but at the same time, as all the policy documents, especially after the 7th five-year plan, it has been focused that most of the environmental pollution in India is also by the very process of the development which were bereft and devoid of the ecological consideration because of the backdrop that India wanted to accelerate the economic growth at a very faster plane, and in its pursuit to see economic development on a very faster pursuit, it slightly deviated from the ecological concern, and it created and precipitated environmental crisis. These two broad areas which has been realized right from the 7th five-year plan and its delineation and its confession in all environmental policies in India. Now, this national environmental policy tried to see beyond that, and that beyond that, it tries to see that the key objectives of this policy is to maintain critical resources, intra and intergenerational equity, integration of environmental concerns into the economic development, promoting the efficiency in resource. Thus, the key objectives of this policy and the principles of these policies are to be taken afresh, and we see a new lease of life have been inserted by way of the national environmental policy in taking a very broader look of not only it's the legal basis and the legal foundation which has been concretized and which requires a new set of the specification of environmental policy, but the very key objective have taken very critical areas and very gray areas of environment which was hitherto not covered by these kind of the policies which we had earlier discussed and pursued. And the principle on which this national environment policy rests upon is the basic premise of the human-centered sustainability. It talks about the polluter pays, it talks about precautionary principle, and it also talks about the public trust doctrine into and calls a suitable adjustment on all the legal and legislative reforms and impact assessment laws in this country so that the national environment policy can really be taking as a very ambitious role and overarching role as an umbrella role to cover all kinds of environmental policies in India. With this, we will also be taking that how national environmental policy, besides taking recourse to 3 decades of the judicial pronouncement in giving effect to right to environment as a basic fundamental right and charting new objectives and incorporating and doctrinating new principles of sustainable development into the policy specification. This policy has also given an insight to coastal resource zone policy and as well as the challenges which are thrown open by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Bonn Guidelines, Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, and as well as the Nagoya Protocol in relation to, especially it devoted to the question of living modified organism and as well as the other issues of environment and biotechnology and intellectual property rights issues were also being focused. It also talks about that how a comprehensive CRZ policy, a comprehensive LMO policy, and how a policy of the environmentally sensitive zone are to be carried out along with a comprehension of the environment impact assessment So the one focus is CRZ, the other focus is the living and modified organism, and the other focus is the environmentally sensitive zone, and the fourth focus is what is called environment impact assessment. And that's why it's not surprising to see that the EIA aspect, under the broad caption and the broad guidance of the National Environment Policy, have resulted into a kind of the growth, and that growth happens to be that in 2006 we had EIA notification. So this is not by way of accident, but what has been permeated into the National Environment Policy and giving focus about the environment impact assessment to have a broader concept of what has been underpinned, that economic, social, and ecological concern must be integrated into the planning that has been visited into the National Environment Policy 2006. With this, my dear viewers and the learner, we will try to see the, the entire conspectus of the National Environmental Policy into a detail, and we will try to gauge that how the National Environment Policy 2006 has been one of the instrument in giving the new shapes to environmental policies and as well as laws in India. That's why we can say that the National Environment Policy happens to examine the relationship between the development and environmental conservation which have taken place into 3 decades. The broad agenda of the NEP 2026 happens to be that it try to introspect and retrospect. So the retrospect is the 3 decades of the legal and jural development, and then by introspection of the 3 decades, the planning at one stage, policies at another stage, and judicial recognition on the other estate 1, 2, and the 3 in the last over 3 decades that this policy tried to have, and then it indulges into retrospect, and then it also try to see that what are the prospects, and having a prospect, it focus on India with reference to global and developing nations, meaning thereby here that what is the universalism and what is particularism. So a wholesale copying of the international environmental law and the policy will not be very feasible. Therefore, what it tries to see that it wanted to focus on global interest and as well as the imperatives and congenialities of the developing countries and the Indian scenario by having a theoretical understanding of the entire spectrum of policy, its application, its pitfalls, and the promises. It also tried to see and unearth the ethical undertones, meaning thereby the traditional environmentalism which is in focus in India and which has been practiced in India, and by emphasizing upon and stressing upon the ethical undertones and cross current, it tries to influence the decision making process on environment and development in a very rational and in a very legitimate manner, so that the international input and as well as the Indian content of the environmental conservation and planning and policy are to be synergized in such a way, then we can have what is the broad goals of the National Environmental Policy 2006 is to one, dematerializing growth, meaning thereby what M.K. Gandhi has said, that we have, nature has enough for our need, but not for greed. This is what that has been underlined by the ethical undertones, and then it can, if this policy can be pursued in a logical end, then we have dematerializing growth, we have a kind of a social metabolism and degrowth movement by a very judicious use of the environmental resources for need, not for greed. Therefore, what we see that the National Environment Policy in its right earnest recognizes policy challenges. It also adopts a multidisciplinary borrowings of the ideas and the notion and innovations and ideations, and it tries to merge with the local requirement and the national imperatives and interests, and taking a stakeholders diversity and the local and global balance. It addresses vital and key issues of the water, waste management. It discusses the issues of the Biodiversity Convention. It also talks about the water and air pollution. It also talks about the climate change, because so far, so good, all the policies in India have been very oblivious of the climate change policy and the climate change scenario, which created a kind of an atmosphere that was not very healthy for environment and sustainable development. Although we'll be devoting one lecture on the climate change policies in India, in contemporary India, because this area deserves to be mentioned in a separate way, and we'll be devoting one lecture on the climate change policies. With this introduction and broad conceptualization of the National Environment Policy, what we see that it has, when it talks about the 3 decades, then it has also taken note of the 42nd constitutional amendment, which inserted Article 48A and 51G, along with what is called Article 21 of the Indian Constitution 1953 to create a kind of a clean environment. What is important here is to see that citizen, the state and citizen both were enjoined the duty. The state has a duty under Article 48A, where the citizen has a duty under Article 51AG. Therefore, the National Environmental Policy is a partner-based environmental management, and it integrates not only the legal aspect, not only the economic aspect, but it tries to incorporate the ethical aspect and in the entire framework of sustainability and sustainable development. The key challenges which this policy has underlined is again, which is very central to our concern, is the poverty and environment and growth kind of the nexus, and how this nexus, along with the interrelationship of air, water, land, and biodiversity loss, can be linked into, and how it can be judiciously managed by a kind of a planned urbanization, have a very robust industrial pollution mechanism, and a kind of a judicious resource-based management, so that the pressure of the population, so that the urban sprawl and the haphazard planning, and so that the massive uh, pollution which has been created by the industries and which are accelerating the degradation of the environmental resources are to be addressed in right earnest. The other drivers of the environmental degradation happens to be, besides the poverty and the population, we have the vital issue of right to access by the poor people, and how this policy can develop a kind of a system, a kind of a mechanism which we have disincentive, which has market failure, which tries to see the governance gaps, meaning thereby that the policy specification, it matters to land degradation, air degradation, noise pollution, water quality uh, loss, biodiversity loss, and other kinds of the pollution can be covered not by a kind of a command and control approach, but kind of, kind of an approach which incentivizes the environmental compliance. So, incentive for environmental compliance, how it can be maintained, that remains one of the focus of the Environmental Policy 2006. It also addresses to the question of the drought, floods, extreme temperature, pests, diseases, soil degradation, air pollution, and try to see that what are the prime causes and what are the consequences. Both are to be studied to understand that what environmental stress are there and the drivers and the motivators of the environmental policy 2006 NEP is something is engaged very heavily on these aspects of sustainable agriculture as well as the biodiversity. And thus we see the drivers and the movers of the motivators and the movers of the national environment policy rightly see what are, at the one hand, what are the causes, what are the consequences, and then it try to see that what deleterious impact it is going to create on 20% of India's disease burden because of the environmental effect on the human health, along with the malnutrition, unclean water, indoor air pollution, and poor sanitation. It creates a demand for a public health governance, clean water mechanism, and sanitation improvement program, and that's it tries to dovetail environment with health. So far, in most of the policies, we have seen it has a very myopic and cabin perception, but for the first time, what we see that in EP has addressed the question of health with that of environment. And then in this sense, what we see that the objective of National Environment Policy 2006 talks about intergenerational equity, it talks about intragenerational equity, intergenerational equity, and it tries to integrate environmental concern into all sectors of planning by efficient resource use, good governance, and conservation funding. Then the key principles is that the human should be at the center of sustainable development, and it talks about right to development and as well as the right to environment by applying precautionary principles, by applying polluter pays principle, and by internalizing the environmental cost, so that we must have economic efficiency and as well as we have a conservation mechanism. It also creates some kind of a criminal and civil liability for deterrence and compensation. It recognizes doctrine of public trust because the environment is a trust, and it equally comes very heavily on the industries by recognizing no fault liability and strict liability to make them liable for entire loss of the natural resources, and at the same time it makes the state as a trustee of the natural resources. It has very brilliantly underlined the imperatives of Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which was enunciated in 2004, and therefore the living modified organism, it has devoted for genetically modified crops and as well as living modified crops, meaning thereby it has underlined the biotechnological advancement and its impact from the environmental point of view. At the same time, it addresses the ecosystem and health safety, and it tries to see that how the environment impact assessment as well as the policy on the coastal resource zone can be implemented to see that the broad goals of the environmental policy 2006, as it has been reflected by the EIA notification on 2006, and it has brought some very radical changes on the CRZ notification 2011. That way, we can say that the National Environmental Policy triggered some kind of the legislative reform in matters of the EIA law and the CRZ law. Although we had certain law during British period, but at the same time it has given rise to many new laws in the post-independent India, and most notably it happens to be the National Environment Tribunal Act, National Environmental Tribunal Act, and then we have a judicious mechanism of the adjudication of the environmental disputes, and that way the National Environmental Policy has called for a new sets of law and looking critically on the successes and failures of the post-independent and as well as pre-independence law to reach to a kind of a very robust system of legal policy for environment protection in contemporary India. With this, I think the lecture on the national environmental policy in contemporary India is environment protection policies contemporary India, more so in reference to National Environmental Policy 2006 and its concurrent and satellite development and impact and the ripple impact in giving shape to Indian environmental law is something very important for our understanding for a course like on environmental law in India. With this, I thank and wish you happy learning.